Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another live waterhole with Wild Earth and Africam. And we will spend the next couple of hours delighting in the African wildlife from all of the different camera feeds across the continent. Thank you very, very much for joining us and for joining me. My name is Ben Coley, and I will be your naturalist for the next couple of hours. As many of you already know, this is a live and interactive show, so we would very much love to hear your questions and comments and thoughts and musings and all other things that are going on in your head. And I'll do my best to answer any of those questions that do come our way. Well, I hope you are all well and safe. And what a lovely way to start. We are at Tembe Elephant Park on the eastern side of South Africa, Maputo land, and we've got some elephants enjoying a bit of a drink and doing some digging. So nice to watch these magnificent animals going about their daily life. I was lucky enough to go into Kruger Park last week for the first time since I've been back and was graced with many, many elephants and spent some lovely moments, particularly on those sort of deserted less frequented roads and just parking up and watching elephant bulls going around their lives, digging, feeding, interacting, excuse me, with each other. I'd forgotten how special it is to just spend time with these great animals. Their emotions are so obvious, and there is just a very special feeling about spending time with the elephants. It puts things into perspective. And they have a wonderful aura about them. It's difficult to describe until you've actually just spent time with them, almost spiritual. Of course, here in South Africa, we are in the grips of winter now, although I have to say it's been a very mild winter thus far. Temperatures last night were still in the mid-teens in terms of degrees Celsius, which was quite unusual. That being said, last week I was out doing some space photography, and it got down to about 4 or 5 degrees. So quite variable, but we are going through a relatively mild spell at the moment. But that does mean, for those of you that don't know, that in South African winter, we have very little to no rain whatsoever for many months. So a lot of animals are under water stress. And when you require around about 200 liters of water a day as a big adult bull elephant, you will see many elephants coming down to drink during the heat of the day. So that's why these man-made waterholes are very important. If you're going to put a fence around something and restrict animal natural movements to and from areas that they maybe were used to go to in their past, thanks to the matriarch and that knowledge that's passed down through generations, it's important that if we are restricting their movement, we provide them with all the resources they needed, although not too many. Otherwise, it can very much have a detrimental effect. I see we've got a few messages coming through. Good morning, Michelle Brown. Thank you for your greetings. Glad you can join us. Angela Reed, you're loving the elephants. They are indeed adorable. And they do seem to take centre stage quite literally sometimes on our Live at the Waterhole sessions of late, as I said, because we are next to waterholes. Elephants need water. It's very dry, and they're very much taking the opportunity. And greetings, happy Sunday to you, Mercedes Bean, as well. Nice to hear from you again. And thanks for sending through your messages. Do you keep them coming? As we were saying, wonderful to have these artificial water points. Oh, sorry, we'll come back to that. I've just received a message in my ear. I didn't quite hear where we're going, but we're going somewhere to see something. Let's go have a look. I'm going to Old Donya in Kenya for some more elephants. Wow, look at the tusks on this one closest to us. Huge tusks. Again, more examples of artificial waterholes attracting elephants, particularly elephant bulls up here in Old Donya. There seem to be a surplus of bulls in this area. But look at those tusks on this one closest to us. Doesn't look like the biggest elephant, but a magnificent set of tusks. So I was just saying there, from a conservation management point of view, it's lovely to have these artificial water points for animals, but we do need to be careful not to overdo it, because by doing so, we are causing them to not have to travel far and wide for resources, meaning things stay in certain places, and that can have a detrimental effect on the ecosystem, because animals are staying in one spot and doing a huge amount of damage to the vegetation, to the soil, so on and so forth. It attracts predators, it changes the vegetation in and around that area, and that can lead to problems, certainly for those animals which are quite selective in the types of graze or browse that they prefer. Try to estimate the length, particularly of that left hand tusk there, or I suppose the right one if it was a little straighter as well, but probably around 1.5 meters perhaps. Not often you see elephants with such beautiful tusks as this. Speaking of this sort of management idea of waterholes, one of the well documented stories is the plight of certain antelopes, such as the sable and roan in Kruger National Park. It's very unusual to see those. There are a few scattered around, but their numbers have dwindled massively, and some suggestions are that it was to do with the introduction of too many artificial waterholes to attract animals for obviously for tourism and viewing purposes. So there are some suggestions that when these water holes were introduced, it attracted other animals to the area, as I said. So things like zebra and buffalo, which are bulk grazers, and they may well have changed the type of grass that was growing there, because those areas became overgrazed, which was detrimental to those particular antelopes we were mentioned. And of course, when you're bringing in big herds of other herbivorous animals, you're also bringing with them predators as well, like lions. And any of the sable and rowan and tsetse and those other sorts of antelope definitely took a little bit of a hit due to those predators following the big herds and the change in the vegetation type. But it's very much a learning curve. So a lot of what we understand in terms of managing ecosystems has only come to light in the last few decades. And it's very much a learning process, a learning curve. Kruger has closed many, many artificial water points over the last 30 years or so, as we better understand it. Gavin, DMV, how do reserves gauge how far apart water sources should be? Well, that's what I was saying. We're still sort of learning, and the only way we can do that is by putting these water points in and monitoring the effect that it has on animal movements and on vegetation and soil degradation, overgrazing, and sort of take it from there, really. So there is no right or wrong answer to that question. So much of it will also be dependent on that particular region, what's already growing there, what the population densities are, what are the availability of other resources. There's a lot of factors to take into account. So it's impossible to just give a straight answer as to what is the correct distance between waterholes. And then, of course, it always also gets more complicated in areas that are privately owned because lodges obviously want to attract game to their properties for the enjoyment of their guests, and you end up in areas like the Sabi Sands, the Timbavati, the Manuletti, where there's quite a lot of tourist places to stay. Then there's a lot of artificial water points in those areas because it's more difficult to regulate. So yeah, it's a good question, Gavin, DMV, and one that we are still learning about. But it's because it's so different in different places, we really do have to just monitor when things are put in and react accordingly. Most reserves have ecologists now, and that's their main job is to try and understand and interpret the ecosystem and ensure that things are done for the benefit of the masses as opposed to the benefit of the few, be that putting in water points, building structures, putting in new roads, understanding the soil types and vegetation types and the knock-on effects is very topical, I suppose you could say at the moment. But these elephants seem to be very happy with the situation, and I have to say this waterhole at Old Donyo really does pump. It's almost a guarantee to get exciting things to see, be they elephants or zebras, giraffes, all common sights up here. Chelsea, UK, you're asking how animals are transported safely and ethically when they are being relocated or introduced to new areas. Well, again, a little bit like we were just saying, it is a bit of a learning curve. And obviously, as we understand animal physiology and veterinary science a little bit better, we are improving in this. Regardless, it is a stressful activity for the animals. But generally speaking, those animals will be herded into an area where they can be more easily got to. They will then be tranquilized and then put into whatever transportation devices are being used and then relocated to the new area and released and given the antidote for that tranquilizer, which does not take very long at all, only a few minutes. But often what will happen is those animals will be deposited or delivered into a boma, which is a sort of a small fenced area within the reserve or the area of land that they've been relocated to. And generally speaking, those animals will then remain in that boma for quite a few weeks, if not months. A little bit like you do when you get a new cat and maybe you have it in the house and you don't let it out the house for a few weeks, just so it becomes to associate that area with home. It gets used to the smells, the sounds, and all of those cues to help it use the word relocate again, but to help it become comfortable with its new environment. And once that is done, they will then be released. Often animals will then hang around close to that area because that's where they feel sort of safe and secure, particularly if they were being fed in the case of predators, for example. But then, given time, their natural instincts will kick in and they will slowly start to explore that area and spread out. So there are inherent risks with moving those animals and using certain drugs on animals. We never quite know how they're going to react, but as time goes by, we get better and better, and the success rate is higher and higher. There will always be exceptions, of course, and unfortunate events, but they are far less prevalent now than they used to be, I'm happy to say. Lenny, generally speaking, yes, all big tuskers will be bulls. They will be male elephants. There have been occasions where female elephant cows have been seen with very large tusks, but by no means as common as the big males. It's a mixture of the males growing to a much larger size, being able to support that extra weight, and more importantly, just the structure of the tusks, as with most antelope species as well. The male tusks or horns or whatever species we're discussing are generally thicker and more sturdy and therefore can grow bigger because they are used in dominance displays and for reproductive rights, territorial defense in the case of certain animals, not elephants, of course, they're not territorial. So there have been cases of some very large tusked female elephants, but generally speaking, it'll always be the males. I don't think I've ever seen a female with what I would consider to be massive tusks. I've seen some with impressive tusks, but normally it's the males that you see with tusks of this sort of size, certainly. So don't get me wrong, there are some females within Africa with very large tusks. There are photographs of these, you can have a look at them, but they are few and far between. It's probably also a result of the testosterone levels, as they're saying, for growing big and strong and being a more effective weapon in terms of mating opportunities and passing on that genetics or those genetics. Dream Will, you're asking about contraception while you guys are hammering me with questions this morning. This is good, thank you. Can all animals be put on contraception, and how long is it safe to keep animals on contraceptives? Um, Again, to be honest, Dream Will, I'm not hugely qualified to answer that question. That's more of a somebody with a veterinary background will have a far better knowledge of that. I don't know about all animals in terms of being contracepted, although theoretically I see no reason that the principle would not work, at least. Um, Certainly, lions, other predators, elephants are involved in, or there are contraceptive schemes to try and stop overpopulation in smaller areas. There are various different types of medication that are used, certainly. One that I know that is quite um, well used in elephants and is deemed, to my knowledge at least, to be very effective and safe, is the use of a substance called PZP, which was originally developed in pigs, I think, and it's a particular enzyme or chemical or medicine. Again, I'm not quite sure of the specific terminology that should be used here, that is injected into female elephants. And in very simplistic terms, it creates a um, a protective layer around any eggs within the ovaries, so that after mating has occurred, the male sperm can travel the way it's supposed to do and actually get to the egg, but is just unable to penetrate the egg to actually facilitate fertilization. So the good thing about that, again, as I understand it, is that it doesn't stop any natural behavior, it doesn't suppress any natural behavior. It merely means that an embryo or an egg cannot be fertilized by the sperm. And it is not a permanent situation. It has to be re-administered. I think it's every couple of years, there or thereabouts. And that's excellent. So if you want to control your population numbers for a time, and then you want to allow the population to grow naturally, in inverted commas, then you're able to withhold that treatment, potentially allow fertilization. Oh, an Elon, beautiful. Allow fertilization to occur and then go back onto that contraception. So, to my knowledge, PZP is relatively safe, but that's sort of the extent of my knowledge on that topic. Passenger Elan has decided he wanted to come in for a drink, realised that the waterhole was occupied, and is probably going to have to take up residence now with those zebra and just await their turn. So saw that Elan come and have a little look, and this one with the big tusk just gave a little head nudge in his general direction. And the Elan said, "Okay, I'll wait." Probably good advice. The posture that this elephant's taken up now to ward off the eland. I always feel a bit sorry for these zebra and that one, possibly more eland that we saw a little bit earlier. There's, well, with the exception of this one now who's just decided to take a drink in the last few minutes, nobody's even have a drink. had a drink. They're just standing around the waterhole guarding it, and everybody else has to await their turn, and there's nothing that they can really do about it. I think the elephant should learn how to show. But yeah, definitely a few under there. That's very nice to see. Traffic jam beginning to form, more and more animals flooding in, and they're all going to have to wait their turn. And so on the one on the left, you can clearly see that notch taken out the tip of its tusk. It's obviously lost its other tusk, potentially in a fight with another male, or in some way possibly due to infection, but most likely lost in a fight. So very much favouring the one tusk that he's got. And you can just see for an old elephant like this, probably in his, I would estimate, 30s or so, years and years of utilizing that tusk to snap branches over in order to get food, has actually worn down that tusk and created a perfect little crevice in which to rest those branches and use it as a lever. So, as many of you may know, it is one of the ways you can tell which side the elephant favors, even if they have two tusks of similar length. You'll usually see that one is more worn than the other, and that notch is quite characteristic of a sign of overuse. You'll also see in the wet season in the summer months, one side of the trunk will often be stained a sort of a greenish color because the way in which they wrap their trunk around the grass stems and pluck the grass from the ground. So they will usually always go from one side, and that the chlorophyll, the green color from the grass, will actually stain the trunk as well on either the left or the right hand side. Okay, it sounds like we're going to go to Rosie's pan now, where we've got some more elephants who are perhaps going to use the waterhole a little bit more thoroughly. Oh, elephant pool party time at Rosie's pan. So lots of elephants coming down for a drink during the daytime, something to be very much aware of. Actually, I should say kudos to a guide the other day. I did a guiding assessment a couple of days ago, and we went out a little bit later than normal. And it was certainly pointed out to us that when we stop to the waterhole, to just be particularly vigilant this time of year during the heat of the day, because elephants do often come down to enjoy the cooling water. Very happy to say that they gave an excellent assessment, and they did indeed pass. But this whole right and left-handed thing has got me thinking. I mean, we know it's very well documented in elephants and obviously humans. I actually don't know about other animals. I wonder if lions or monkeys would be a good one to have a look at to see if they are also right or left side dominant in some respect. I think that's something I might do a little bit of reading up on, see if I can find any more information on that. I imagine it is true, but it's not something that I remember reading anything about over the years. Little tactile interactions there between these two young bulls. I suppose why not rest your trunk on somebody else's tusk if they don't have a problem with it? Never seen that actually been done before. Yes, a lot of touching and potentially even putting trunks in mouths and things, but I don't think I've ever seen one rest his trunk on another one's tusk before. Interesting, this one in the foreground, scratching his foot and investigating that little tree stump with his trunk. Possibly some interesting smells in there. Hans, you're asking how a matriarch disciplines disobedient members of the herd. Well, a lot of it, I suppose you could just say it's a very stern voice. There's a lot of respect in elephant society. It's very often, or very unoften, what's the word I want? Very unusual that a youngster will answer back. There's very much a respect for authority and for elders within elephants. But a matriarch will normally be able to restore control pretty quickly. There's a warthog in the background. Um, just with body language and vocalizations, really. Don't forget, we may only hear it as something, but it makes a lot more sense to the other elephants. It's definitely a scolding or a chastising. and so they are a lot less argumentative as a rule than perhaps we are. She may have to get physical at times with a little bit of a nudge, but no young elephant will fight back against a matriarch, or certainly I've never heard of it happening. It's a very respectful society. So if there's a young bull who's getting a little bit too amorous as he approaches sexual maturity, it'll often be the mothers and the matriarch together who will chase them off, again, quite literally, potentially with a show of aggression, chasing, but I don't think it would ever come to full-blooded blows, just because of the instinct will kick in, and as I've said a couple of times already, that sort of respect for authority in elephants is great. I've just got visions of a matriarch picking up a branch and disciplining some young elephants, but I don't think I've ever seen that. But it seems pool time is over. Elephants have moved off. I wonder if the ones at El Doño have allowed the other animals to come and have a drink. Something tells me they're probably still monopolizing the water source, but I'm sure at some point we'll go back and check. Good. I think before we do that, we're going to head up to Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Ah, lovely. We've got some baboons. lilies and feeding on those roots before? They look as if they're harvesting something from the surface of the water or just under the surface of the water. Beetles, perhaps? You're just getting distracted by some of the baboons' antics. They are great fun to watch, baboons. You can really very much relate to them and say a lot of disciplining goes on by the adults to the youngsters. Often hear that particularly late afternoon, early evening when it's time for the baboons to go and roost, to go and sleep in the trees. And sometimes the youngsters are not too keen on this idea, and you do hear quite a lot of argumentative behaviour, certainly. I'm intrigued as to what they're eating because there's obviously plenty of it, whatever it is. If you have any ideas, by all means, let me know. Actually, that's a good question. How do you deal with guests who are trying to feed baboons or any other animals for that matter? Um, well, you have to be sort of harsh but fair, I suppose. Normally, as guides, we do before a drive what's called a pre-drive brief, a safety briefing, and a sort of a do's and don'ts whilst we're out there. And one of the things I often like to sort of mention is to, for example, not call the animals with none of this, here, kitty, kitty, or trying to distract the animal or make the animal look at you. We're not there to influence their behavior. And I think that's very important that we as guides actually have to try and get across to people. And 95% of people understand this, that we are merely observers. We're not there to actually influence what is going on. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, I can count the number of times where people have tried to directly interact with animals on a game drive, probably on two hands over close to 2 decades. The bigger problem comes sort of in the lodges because the monkeys are already coming down because we leave stuff lying around and they're coming to raid tables and things. And then people do tend to sort of feed animals or think it's nice and a cool thing to do to feed the animals. We obviously discourage it where we can, but we can't police everything. But just to try and explain the reasons why as well, that if we start doing that, the animal is then potentially in danger of becoming a problem animal, of doing something that is deemed dangerous at some point. Don't forget, baboons are incredibly strong and much stronger than you think. And if one was to get too aggressive to people or become particularly problematic, it unfortunately will likely be removed. So it might be a nice thing to do to feed an animal, a wild animal, but actually you are doing more harm than good in the long run. So best we can do is try and educate. But I don't think I've had anybody trying to feed a baboon on a drive. So more often than not, it's um, people who want particular photographs. You know, they don't want a photograph of a sleeping lion, or they don't want a photograph of something with its head in the grass. It'll be trying to do things to distract that animal to draw its attention. We try and nail down on that quite quickly and ask people not to. But I have to say, over the last, say, decade, I've mentioned this before, I've noticed a big shift in people's mentality and their respectfulness towards nature. And say 20 years ago, it was all about the photo and getting as close as we can. and now people are far more concerned that we are disturbing the animal, that we are too close, that we are a bad thing in their lives, for want of a better turn of phrase. And that's great to see. This one does seem to be eating vegetation, but the other ones were sitting on the bank fishing around for what wasn't vegetation, I don't think. So interesting to see. Xavier, yes, baboons and monkeys, generally speaking, are diurnal animals. Most of the time, they will sleep at night in the safety of trees. There are a couple of nocturnal primates that we get down here in southern Africa, the bush babies. We have the thick-tailed bush baby, and we have the lesser bush baby, or the galagos. Those are primates in terms of their classification, and they are strictly nocturnal. But all of your sort of great apes and other monkey species, I can't think of any others off the top of my head which are considered nocturnal. So very much a diurnal species. They don't have very good night vision. They've got excellent color vision, like we do. That helps them to select ripe fruits, for example. We can see that with the fact that the females rear end changes color when she's in estrus, bright red, as a visual cue for males, so that we know that their eyes are more dominated by cones than they are by rods, which are the visual cells for color vision as opposed to night vision. So they wouldn't do very well at night time, these sorts of primates. Again, I'm sure they're in other parts of the world. There are primate species more active at night time, but certainly down here in southern Africa, it is just those two bush baby species. Helena, yes, baboons have been documented catching and eating snakes. I've never seen it myself, but they are very much omnivorous. They will feed on all sorts of things, plant and meat-based items. So no reason that they won't eat snake, certainly. I don't think they're intelligent animals. I imagine they would avoid any parts around the venom glands. There are reports of baboons, say, catching snakes, certainly, and eating them, but nothing, not that I've ever seen personally myself. But big adult male baboons will even hunt baby impalas, so they are quite capable of finding meat for themselves. Baboon just also pulled out some roots or some sort of vegetation and ran off. Still confused as to what a lot of these baboons are eating, but I think vegetation is certainly a part of it. You can see some of them pulling at those sort of roots or those aquatic plants. Yeah, that was nice to see some boons, always active. But it sounds like the elephants have moved off at Old Onyo, so let's see what has come down in their place. Ah, spectacular, the quintessential African image of a spread-legged giraffe or giraffes having a drink. That's unusual. You don't normally see giraffe actually wade into the water, uh, more often because I think they're more nervous about crocodiles, but I think they're fairly confident that there are no crocs in this area. But not something you see every day, a giraffe actually getting their toes wet. I suppose it's clever, really, getting your head slightly closer to the water if your feet are below water level. This one's decided that's a good idea as well. Again, we can see just how alert those giraffe are. It just takes one to have a little bit of a twitch, and everybody reacts. Evidently, it didn't bother the zebra. Quick check, make sure the coast is clear, and back to it. Huge number of oxpeckers on the right, particularly. Potentially some disturbance off to the left, which those giraffe are keeping an eye on. They do have a tendency to stare at potential danger. Look at all those oxpeckers there. Well, it looks like timeshare of the giraffes is over. Next up, the zebra. You've got the stallion at the back here, just keeping an eye on his mares as they had a drink. Looks like a sneaky eland right in the background as well, possibly one of the ones that we saw a little earlier. Canine girl, if you're asking, is the habitat climate change and humans having an impact on reproductive success or frequency? Yes, to all of the above, really. Again, there's no real obvious answer to that question, but yes, certainly. Habitat, perhaps not so much so, though that being said, animals do have this sort of inbuilt ability to understand if they're in an overcrowded area, and then they will sort of quell their reproductive rate to fit in and find a natural balance with their ecosystem or their habitat at the time. We've certainly seen that in elephants. Elephants that are in an area where there are lots of elephants don't reproduce as often and don't start reproducing as young as elephants that are in an area with lots of space. That's been well documented. Um, Climate change, I'm not so sure of. I mean, the obvious answer is yes, but that will affect the availability of food potentially and resources and water, which will have a knock-on effect to it, certainly. But uh, absolutely human encroachment. But it all really comes down to space. And so it's rather, again, a good lesson that we could learn from the animal kingdom for the majority of species that given a particular area, the birth rate will change depending on how much space and resource availability there is. The biggest potential issue of something like climate change is that we are changing the climate far more quickly than it would likely otherwise be doing so. And animals, of course, have the ability to adapt, otherwise, they wouldn't have got as far as they have done in terms of evolutionary success. But evolution is a very slow process. That selective nature of it, natural selection, works over countless generations. When things start to change very, very quickly, it's too fast for nature to keep up with. I think the flexibility of that bottom jaw, chewing on that little bolus of food, which will have been regurgitated from the first chamber of the stomach. When she swallows, you'll see that lump sort of disappear down the throat, and then due to a sort of a peristaltic action, there it goes, there goes the little ripple. And when she regurgitates, we'll see that lump come all the way up the throat and back into the mouth. Wait for it to come back up again. There it is, there's the ripple. And so hugely important to just reprocess that food, break it up into smaller and smaller pieces, increase the surface area, just aid the those four chambers of the stomach in terms of being able to extract every last possible piece of nutrition and particularly moisture from it. Those of you that know giraffe dung will know that they are ridiculously small for such a large animal. They produce these little pellets, which are not much bigger than kudu droppings, for example, for an animal that's 3 or 4 times the size and weight. But such is the efficiency of their stomach. Everything is utilized, particularly the water. Those little pellets do not stick together at all because there's almost no moisture in them. And if you break open a giraffe pellet, it's very, very hard and compacted, but inside it's basically just dust. You'll do well to find any piece of recognizable plant matter in there. I think Canine Girl, just going back to your question, something else just popped into my mind, which I'm sure we've mentioned before, but in certain reptiles, you have what's called uh, temperature dependent sex variation, where embryo development in terms of whether it's going to be a male or a female is affected by the temperature during incubation. And there was a situation that was well documented in the Kruger National Park a few years ago, where we were getting a surplus of, I just have to remember which way round it is in crocodiles. Give me a second. Was it surplus of males or females? But it was because of the alien vegetation that was beginning to dominate the banks of rivers and things. So crocodiles, when they lay their eggs, they'll move away from the edge of the water, move up the sand, and then dig their holes and lay their eggs. And what was happening was because of the thickness of the vegetation, because of alien plant species that were dominating those areas, they were creating a huge amount of shade, and that was affecting the temperature at which those eggs were developing. And we were getting very much a skewed population ratio of those eggs because the temperatures had suddenly become an awful lot cooler. I'm trying to remember because it's the other way around in tortoises than it is in crocodiles. Warmer temperatures in tortoises produce female embryos, so warmer temperatures in crocodiles will produce male embryos. So we were having too many females and not enough male crocodiles because of that shade. So that's an example where a change happened very, very quickly, and there was an immediate knock-on effect in terms of the reproductive, I'd say success, because it wasn't necessarily a problem with success, but it certainly changed the dynamics of the situation. There are now, of course, projects to remove alien vegetation from many reserves in order to make sure that the ecosystem stays pristine and unaffected by outside influences. It could potentially also have a knock-on effect. I'm thinking laterally now in terms of predation of those eggs. A large overhanging of alien vegetation over the beaches would have made those things that come and dig up crocodile eggs, like monitor lizards and jackals, more sheltered from their respective predators as well. So they would have been able to operate without so much fear of being spotted. So it's interesting when you actually sort of dig down and start picking through the bones of everything as to how many of those knock-on effects by something as simple as excess vegetation can actually have. This is the longest period that I can remember at El Doño where we haven't seen any animals, but just because the mammals have gone, it's made space for the birds to come down. Oh, the little lizard. Good spot, whoever's operating the camera. Catching little flies. They actually look like bees, potentially. But that's not uncommon in the winter months. You get a lot of bees coming to look for water, hanging out around taps and things. Unfortunately, I'm not quite sure what this lizard is. It's got rather gecko-like features. It's rather sort of stunted face. It just shows even when you don't see large mammals, there's still quite literally a hive of activity around water points. Oh, there we go, a live gill. So bravo to the camera operators there. Very, very cool. Here comes another one. This is obviously a good spot. Rhonda, never say never, but generally speaking, no, we don't find many lizards in particularly cold areas because of that requirement or inability to regulate body heat internally. It's all reliant upon energy from the sun to warm up the body and the muscles to get everything working at optimum capacity. We've got a lot of lizards in hot areas because it's easy enough to seek shade and cool down if the temperatures get too oppressive. Just wondering whether he's purposely avoiding bees and flies. I would think so. But yeah, it's more difficult the other way around. If yeah, that one's got something in its mouth. More difficult the other way around. If it's too cold and there's no ability to warm up, then you'll find almost no activity in terms of reptiles. So never say never. There may be some. Oh, look at that huge spider hunting wasp. That's very cool. Oh, I'm liking this. We don't normally get to see this sort of close-up micro activity. Swallow your food. There we go. Yeah, so that big sort of metallic blue wasp that we just saw, that's the one that specializes in paralyzing spiders. Often will then gnaw off the legs and then drag the poor unsuspecting spider back to its lair and leave it in there with some eggs, completely paralyzed, unable to move, and then the eggs will hatch and the larvae will slowly ingest that spider feeding off it. And the amazing thing I've always found with those insects is that it's been recorded that they kind of know the order in which to eat things to make your food preserve last as long as possible. Because the most nutritious parts of an animal will be the vital organs. But if you eat the vital organs, then everything else dies. So they know to only eat those things towards the end to get the maximum amount of benefit out of the food that they've got. We also get some forms of parasitic wasps in particular that actually lay their eggs on an animal and then that larvae will burrow into the body and eat the poor animal from the inside out and then re-emerge and pupate. We see that sometimes in caterpillars, and there are species of wasps that do the same thing to spiders. And they're quite happily doing their thing, but getting eaten from the inside out. That's something out of a horrific horror movie. Ken Angel, I agree with you. Great to see the smaller things, sightings, and interactions. So much more going on than we often realise. Are you asking about the camouflage idea of zebras? Well, there's your answer. Pretty much as you look at it, this dazzling effect. The idea, one of the theories, the many theories of zebra stripes, is from a protective perspective. Now, I know to us, those zebras look very, very obvious, and black and white striping would be the least inconspicuous thing you could possibly think of. But remember that most predators who are going to hunt zebras, things like lions, generally speaking, um, are nocturnal animals. And unlike the baboons we were talking about earlier, they have more rods than cones, and they generally only see in black and white or very, very muted colors because their eyes are not designed for that. So if you imagine you saw the entire environment in black and white, then suddenly it does become a lot more difficult to anticipate the movements and predict the movements of something like a zebra. Generally speaking, zebras are going to be in open plains with lots of tall stems of grass, which are also going to be in blacks and whites and various shades of grey, and it's more difficult to pick them out. But the general theory is that by staying together as a group, it becomes far more difficult for a predator to isolate a particular individual. Because if you try and sort of, oh, they look like superb starlings. If you try and chase an entire herd, you'll get distracted and you start chasing one and then another one and then another one, and then they've all disappeared. So really the best trick from a hunting perspective is to choose one individual and focus on it, and it becomes very difficult to target that individual because the stripes all seem to merge together as one. And it's one of the reasons we think that zebra foals have such long legs. Yes, they have to be agile and active and avoid predators very quickly, but by having almost the same belly height as the adults, then they disappear into this melee of stripes almost from the day that they are born, and far more difficult for a predator to isolate a youngster who would be more vulnerable. There is also the idea that, say, stripes moving at high speed become very difficult to anticipate what I would call sort of an interception point. So a lion has to potentially, if it's going to intercept a zebra, has to work out the trajectory and change his course of direction, its bearing accordingly. And it's quite difficult to do that when you've got stripes moving at high speed, particularly large numbers of them. But as we have discussed before, it's generally considered now that generally I'm very much hedging my bets, but generally considered that probably um, the evolution of the stripes has something to do with flies and parasites, because those contrasting blacks and whites make it very difficult for flies to sort of gauge depth perception, and they have a tendency to fly into the animal as opposed to alighting on the animal and sort of knock themselves senseless and fall down to the ground. They've done various experiments with horses wearing different coloured jackets, some black, some white, some stripy. They've done other stuff with paint, and flies seem to not like this contrasting dark and light coloration. So many, many theories about zebra stripes. A nice thing that you can do is if you're out with guests, if you actually take a picture of a group of zebra and then have a look at it and then take another picture and then make that picture black and white, you can suddenly see how potentially effective that camouflage can be when everything that you see is in black and white. I mean, have a look at the leg length of those youngsters. Almost the same height, belly height wise, so they just disappear into the crowd. still quite fluffy, these youngsters. Looks like there's a nice breeze blowing today. This one on the left looks very much pregnant. You can see how swollen her stomach looks, no offense. Also in the background, just trying to find out what that reptile was. I do remember we've discussed it before. I think it's actually now a type of agama, which would make sense from its appearance, and that long tail definitely wasn't a gecko, which I think I did incorrectly state. So some form of agama. Trying to remember, I'm sure somebody has told me in the past. Spiny-tailed agama, perhaps? Yeah, quick look online, promise. It's very, very difficult to do it from memory as a East African rainbow lizard, which looks similarly coloured. I'm not convinced. But as lovely as it was to have seen the elephants and the eland and the zebras and the birds, I have to say that was very cool to watch those little lagamas hunting there. Birds coming down for a quick bathe. Sandy Franklin, I'm glad you feel you've learnt so much from all of the guiding team here and the naturalist team. There's so much interesting stuff, and we should never stop learning. Um, I always say that whenever I think I know everything, I shall go and do something else because I think that's a very arrogant statement. There is so much to learn from the natural world, particularly of the smaller things. And yeah, we're so lucky we live in an age where information is just the click of a button away. Of course, you have to be careful of verifying that information. Um, but if you want to find something out, there is the opportunity to do so, and we can learn so much from it. And it adds such value to our lives as well. Instead of just watching, we can understand. And I think that's very important. And it's good to regularly see things we don't understand. It gives us a sense of perspective and wonder. Tenby Elephant Park. Not often that we don't have any visitors at Oldonio. I'm sure it won't last for very long. We can normally do a whole 2 hours just at Oldonio, but nice to be able to flit between the different locations and different cameras. So back at Tenby, where we started, there's still plenty of elephants enjoying this little oasis here. As you nudge from that one, he decided that particular spot on the bank is where he wanted to stand. Just push the other one out the way. So this one on the right doesn't look too happy about being ousted from his position there. He looks a little bit forlorn. It's like, fine, I shall drink over here then. And some lovely little interactions. The smaller one there so did put the trunk in the other one's mouth and they had a little bit of a head rub. Some very close relationships. Big rip taken out of this, the small one in the middle's ear there. It almost looks sort of tusk-like, and perhaps the initial injury was from a tusk that was then ripped through the skin. Always potential for a branch, of course, as well, but that just got a funny feeling that particularly there in the centre, the top part of the rip almost looks cylindrical in nature, like a perhaps during a slightly overzealous fight with one of his brethren. He got a tusk in the ear and pulled his head away. It ripped through the skin. Remember that skin of the ear is very, very thin, only a few millimeters thick in comparison to the rest of it. Very normal to find elephants with damaged ears, sometimes with completely damaged cartilages, causing their ears to flop. There are a few of those we see at Tenby from time to time. But yeah, a lot of these things happen at a young age before the skin is sort of properly toughened up. Being caught on bits of vegetation whilst running through vegetation, or more than likely in one of these little tests of dominance and hierarchy negotiations that take place between these adolescents. Nice to see the impala in the foreground as well. Note how they're eating the very, very short grass. There's plenty of grass to be had here, but that's their favourite food. That very short grass, any new little sprigs that are sprouting up from underneath the soil, very, very quickly taken by the impala. That split lip that they've got, enabling them to get very, very close to the surface and getting those young, nutritious shoots. Of course, not many this time of year, but possibly with the prevalence of water there, there may well be a little bit of growth. You can still see some little green flushes in the area where they are. Adam, this is your first time tuning in and you're loving it. Well, I'm very glad that A, you found us and that B, you have chosen to stay with us, and I'm sure you'll be joining us regularly. But yeah, we're very, very lucky. There aren't many places that can bring you live, genuine, wild experiences like this. You never know what you're going to see. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes we see some incredible things. So do stick with us. You never know. It's the beauty of the bush. It's unpredictable and unscripted. And so to any of you who have recently joined us, don't forget you can send in any questions and comments. We'll do our best to air them where we can and try and answer what we can, if we can. As I always say, we encourage it even if we can't answer the questions. It gives us as the naturalists things to go and research. And we will always do our best to try and answer those questions at a later date. Well, speaking of impalas, things have settled down in the impala world of late. The rut has pretty much finished now, or should have finished in most cases. You may still find the occasional slightly overzealous male, but that very specific breeding season, which is normally April, May time, very much over. So the majority of these females will now be pregnant, developing those embryos, and almost all of them will give birth once we get into sort of November time, November, December, and the market will be absolutely flooded with little baby impalas, and we'll have creches of baby impalas. It'll be a field day for the predators of all things, from large eagles like the martial eagle that'll take a young impala, to the baboons we mentioned earlier, to the more apex predators of the lions, the hyenas, the cheetahs, the leopards. There will be a bountiful supply of food, and that's normally the way for herbivore animals. They, sort of in inverted commas, they know their gestation periods and they will have their mating periods at the appropriate time of the year, which will be stimulated by the length of daylight in their pineal glands in their heads, which regulates the release of the appropriate hormones to begin the breeding process. And they will generally always work it out so that they give birth in conjunction with the rain. So what we were talking about earlier with whether reproductive success can be altered by habitat and climate change. If it was to suddenly happen very quickly and our rainy season was to happen at a different time of the year, there would be a huge knock-on effect. And many youngsters wouldn't survive because those rainy seasons bring with them food, water, shelter, and also food for mums as well, who have got to produce milk, are slightly less mobile because they've got youngsters more vulnerable to predators, so have to be able to hide. So there would be a big problem if suddenly the whole climate shifted overnight or over a period of a year or two, because all of those breeding times and calving or lambing seasons, whatever you want to call it, would be off kilt. Olivia, I suppose you could say that there are 50 shades of grey in elephants, but generally speaking, they're all that sort of slate grey colour. The colour that you actually see when you see an elephant will be almost always dictated by the colour of the soil because of the habit they have of dust bathing and throwing mud on each other, or on themselves, I should say. That will often be the defining feature of the colour of the animal that we see that is then having a swim. So when we go and look at some of the cameras in Madikwe, the soil there is quite red, so you'll often see the elephants there. Also manifest as this almost sort of brick reddish colour. If you go to areas where there's more calcium in the soil, the elephants will seem a lot whiter in colour, but the actual skin colour between most elephants is very, very similar. It will only be changed by the dust and the mud on the soil that they are anointing themselves with. You do sometimes get leucistic elephants or albinism in elephants, where you have a distinct lack of pigment and you have much more obvious pink coloration or whitish skin. But those are rare, but they do occur. I remember seeing one here at Tembe a few weeks ago that had a sort of a very pinkish tip to the trunk, where there was obviously a lack of melanin in that particular area of the body. The same is true for any animal that likes to play around in the mud. So rhinos, warthogs will also generally have the color of the soil in which they spend most of their time living in. But this elephant's got a great idea. Everybody else milling around on the bank, dipping their trunks in. This one just said, nope, I'm going straight in and having a good splish splash. Really is a beautiful, peaceful environment here at Tembe. I'd certainly come here if I was an elephant. I've said it many times before, but I just love this tree, this weeping Bourbeam tree that's growing out of the dam, standing like a sentinel, watching all of this. Imagine what that tree has seen over the years. It's always amazing that trees that live in or next to water like this, um, They always seem to keep their leaves a lot longer. We were actually talking about it on our drive the other day. They've obviously got access to plenty of water, or keep their leaves and their green colour far longer. But yeah, it's like this great watcher watching over the dam. I see a little family of Egyptian geese sitting in its shade there. And I wish all more the elephants would go into the water like this one. There's a couple who've gone all the way in. It's often the youngsters, I guess the male or the larger ones, they've got a little bit more self-restraint. They could be having a great splash there. Sanjay Roy also pointing out that when water is very scarce and there isn't much availability of water and mud, that you'll get matriarchs and other female elephants chasing around members of other groups. Yeah, it does happen, certainly. I've seen it many times that elephants get very protective over their water and those resources. Generally, if family groups know each other, even if they're different family groups, they will tolerate one another. But yeah, if an interloper or an alien group that the other ones don't know, then absolutely they will get protective over those limited resources. Survival of the fittest, looking after your own. This elephant's having a blast. But no, I'm just going to lie down in the middle of the waterhole. No one else is going to do it. That's your fault. That's what the other ones are thinking. Oh, it's him again. But then they get all animated and have a good splash around. It really is the personification of joy. Yeah, there we go. Have a sit down. I'm surprised we don't see it more often. So I see this older one on the bank, just looking over occasionally, thinking, "What are you doing? Stop acting the fool." You often get asked how deep these waterholes are. Well, there is your answer. It's just above belly height of this elephant. You'll be able to gauge it perfectly now. Yeah, maybe this older one has decided that the youngster's got a good idea. It's going to entice them into the water. Get down your reservations, older boy. We're gonna have some fun. Like, look, it's nice in here. But no, it's a bit cold for me. I shall go back out onto the side, thank you. Absolutely gorgeous to see. I feel like this young one deserves some credit. He's sort of paved the way for the other ones to also take a few tentative steps into the depths. He's the protagonist, the ringleader. Pioneer. I like him. He's got attitude. So we can see there, Olivia, you were asking about the colour. We can see this bigger bull on the left throwing all the dust over himself. If that one who we just saw in the water did the same, all that dust and mud will coat or stick to his skin, and that will very much be indicative of the colour that we will see once everything dries out. So always good sun protection, and then good to go and cover yourself in dust and have a good scratch. Acts like an exfoliant. Get rid of any of those ectoparasites because elephants, just like anything else, do get ticks and irritated skin and itches that they can't scratch. Not that you'll be finding many ticks on the back of an elephant or the side. They will be congregated around the armpits, the groin, and the anus region where the skin is much, much softer, so the ticks can actually get a good grip. True beauty comes from within. You say such beauty. I agree with you. Isn't nature spectacular? Beautiful from a visual perspective, but also just watching the innocence of nature, of things going about their daily lives, utterly devoid of knowledge of the fact that we are watching them and that there are potentially millions of people delighting in them doing their thing. Yeah, that was a very special sighting. They're beautiful to see those elephants enjoying the water at Tembe. I think we're going to move to the other side of the continent now. We're going to head west to Okakoyo in Etosha, Namibia. Very, very different landscape here. You can see the reddish soil around the water there. That will give a little bit of coloration to any elephants that want to cover themselves in that mud, whereas a lot of Etosha is quite whitish in colour. So generally the elephants you do see there are quite pale due to the soil type. There's a little secret meeting going on the right-hand side here. But psst, 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 don't let the zebras hear what we're saying. A little burst of activity when the biggest one now in the middle pushed the other one out the way. They're having a discussion that the other one is not privy to. The youngster on the outskirts, would say all a little bit of dominance and hierarchy and social inter almost looks as if this one of in the middle now is choosing to have 40 winks while standing up, which is quite normal for elephants and in other animals as well. The ability to lock their knees, their legs very much sort of almost like four table legs under the bulk of their body. And they can pretty much just switch off and thankfully not fall over. It's quite a lot of effort for an elephant to lie down and then get back up again. Nope, suddenly a burst of energy again. Rain, you're asking what are the reasons that Ellies may fight? Well, generally speaking, it's all to do with the girls. It's about establishing dominance from a hierarchy perspective and social interaction, but more often than not, it's because two males are arguing over a female. It's the most common reason for fighting. That's why a lot of people know about the elephants in their reproductive state, their must state with their heightened levels of testosterone when they become a lot more aggressive. And if they feel another elephant is going to get in their way in terms of reproductive opportunity, they will remove this obstacle. But a lot of the time, elephants will just say interact with each other. It's about establishing dominance between themselves. Um, a lot of it is quite sort of gentle, like this. This is not fighting. This is a little bit of pushing and shoving, a little bit of fun, a little bit of sort of general interaction, I suppose you could just call it that. It's certainly not a serious fight. And the other main reason that other animals fight, of course, is to hold territories, but elephants are not territorial animals. They don't defend a territory, they don't mark a territory. They have what are called home ranges, so areas that they will stay in because that area has all of the things that they need. But the boundaries of that home range are not set. It can expand and contract depending on the availability of resources. And it really doesn't matter how many individuals are within that area because they all share the land. Things like white rhino bulls or lions, leopards, these are all examples of territorial animals. But the elephants have no reason to fight over land. They may defend water, particularly, as we've discussed. But generally speaking, any fights is to do with mating opportunity. Thanks, Canine Girl. I'm glad you've enjoyed the show and some of the great sightings that we've had. And yeah, I wish everybody a thoroughly enjoyable rest of their Sunday. We are beginning to run out of time now. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but it's been an absolute pleasure to spend the afternoon with you all, trying to be the translator of nature that we have seen. But we've seen some lovely things. It's very much been a day dominated by elephants. But I think my highlights have been that, say, rather zealous youngster at Tembe who decided to go in for a swim, much to the bemusement of the other ones, I might add, from what we saw. Although I feel that he may have started a trend, so good for him. But I think I have to say the highlight for me was that Agama grabbing flies and seeing that spider hunting wasp and watching the bees buzz around there. It's so difficult to show you those sorts of things on these sort of wide view cameras, and awesome to see some of the smaller stuff going on. There is so much happening, even when you don't see any big animals. If you dig deeper, there's hundreds and hundreds of organisms all living together and interacting together. The mechanisms that they have, the strategies that they have, the adaptations that they have really are staggering. And I enjoyed seeing the baboons because we don't often get a chance to see baboons and watch baboons and their antics. But alas, we are into the last minute of today's live at the waterhole. So, for all of you who sent in questions, thank you very much, and for your comments. And to everybody who's been watching, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. This was a little one-off for me. I won't be back again tomorrow, but I will be back, I think, on the 20th and doing a few consecutive days then, which I'm very much looking forward to. And don't forget, as soon as this is finished, you can catch up with the naturalists at our live locations, hear a little bit more about what their plans are for this afternoon and things that they've seen. And then don't forget to join them for the afternoon safari. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thanks, everybody, and have a lovely day.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome on board here. Welcome to the tent here in Juma Private Game Reserve, where the sun is